The Roman Empire at its peak was a power that was unparalleled in the history of ancient Western Eurasia. North to south, the empire stretched from modern-day Scotland to the Sahara Desert, west to east from Gibraltar to Mesopotamia, to encompass an area that was larger than the European Union is today. Not only was the Roman Empire larger, however, but also more centralized. As for the better part of 3 centuries, this enormous empire was ruled by a single man. A considerable achievement, when we also take into consideration just how much slower communications were in the days of the Romans. Yet, despite the glittering success of the early Roman Empire, by the mid-3rd century the political system of Emperor Augustus began to crumble, and under the weight of civil war, foreign invasion and natural disasters, the empire nearly collapsed. The worst was avoided due to the military and organizational genius of a line of tough soldier emperors, but the entity that emerged was considerably changed. One of the most important changes that emerged from this period was the fact that from the reign of Diocletian onward, the empire was usually ruled by more than one emperor, a development that eventually led to the permanent split that divided Rome into a Western and Eastern empire. The question we can then ask is, why? Why did the political system of Augustus begin to crumble in the mid-3rd century? And why was the split of the empire a necessary reform to stabilize the turmoil? To answer these questions, we need to take a look at both the empire and the world outside of it, and see the political changes that went through both within and out of the frontiers of Rome. By the time the imperial borders became stabilized, the frontier of Rome in Europe was anchored at the Rhine and Danube, while in Asia the Roman frontier was situated at Mesopotamia and the Armenian highlands. The first question we can ask is, why did the empire's expansion halt at these places? In Europe, initially under the reign of Emperor Augustus, the legions pushed even deeper into Germania, but his successor Tiberius withdrew from some of the conquests and established the Roman frontier along the banks of the river Rhine. According to historian Peter Heather, this decision was motivated by 2 reasons. Thanks to the fact that transport by water was faster than by land, the supplying of the legions was easier if the frontier was anchored along major river lines, and these supply problems should not be underestimated. As a force of only 5,000 men, a single legion needed a daily supply of 7,500 kilos of grain and 450 kilos of fodder. If we multiply this number for 365 days and 28 legions and roughly the same number of auxiliaries, we quickly arrive to an enormous quantity of food and fodder. A quantity that the local area where the legions were stationed had no capacity to supply directly. While the earlier Roman conquests were aimed at rich pickings such as the Carthaginian Empire or the Greek successor kingdoms, as time went on, the Romans began to annex all the lands that were worth to be conquered. By the time the imperial system came about, the Roman Empire faced a situation where the expansionist ideology and the ambitions of individual rulers drove the legions into lands where the gain versus profit equation was turning negative. In the end, Emperor Tiberius refrained from trying to permanently conquer the scarcely populated, but heavily forested Germania. As to put it simply, he did not believe the effort was worth its price, a decision that made the Rhine, rather than the Elbe, the frontier of Rome. While in Europe, the Romans were faced by Germanic, nomadic or Dacian tribesmen, in Asia, the principal rival of the Romans was the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were a formidable warrior people whose combination of heavy cavalry and horse archers inflicted some heavy defeats on Crassus and Mark Antony, but by the time of the emperors, the Romans stabilized their eastern frontier, and Trajan even overran Mesopotamia and planned to annex it in its entirety. Before he was able to consolidate his conquests, however, Trajan was forced to turn back as rebellions broke out in his rear, and he died en route due to illness. He was succeeded by his adopted son Hadrian, but Hadrian turned out to be more of an administrator rather than conqueror, and decided to evacuate Mesopotamia and end the wars of conquests. From Hadrian on, Roman emperors no longer tried to annex Mesopotamia and were content to defend the borders and make minor annexations after successful wars. Yet, despite the lack of an ambitious expansionist agenda on the part of the Romans, conflicts between Rome and the Parthians continued to flare up during the 2nd century, though the Romans generally had the upper hand by now, which led to one crucial political development. The defeats of the 2nd century undermined the Arsacid ruling dynasty of the Parthian Empire, and in the early 3rd century, a native Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, overthrew the Arsacids. The new rulers of Persia quickly proved to be a more formidable foe for the Romans, and under the reigns of Ardashir and Shapur, they launched numerous attacks against the Roman Middle East, inflicting several defeats on the Romans, defeated and even captured emperors, sacked many cities and plundered their way through the countryside of the provinces. The new rulers of Persia also exploited the resources of their own empire more efficiently, and under their reign, irrigation projects were began in Mesopotamia, leading to a growth of population, and thus tax revenue. Altogether, the Romans were now up against a new enemy that tested their ability to defend their empire much more thoroughly, and forced the Roman state to implement a series of reforms to see off the new challenger. To contain the new threat, the Roman army of the East needed to be enlarged, while at the same time the defenses on the other frontiers had to be kept up also, leading to the growth and reorganization of the later Roman army. The exact steps through which the army of the Principate transformed into the late Roman army are not certain, but by the reign of Emperor Constantine the Great, the Roman army was made up of the border guards and mobile field armies. The border guards, known as the limitanae, were the soldiers who were stationed on the frontiers and were manning the forts and watchtowers, while the comitatenses were the mobile field forces, who were stationed behind the frontiers and were tasked to deal with invaders who broke through the first line of defense. The size of the Roman army is also believed to have grown substantially during the 3rd century. Under the reign of the Severan emperors, the Roman army was estimated to have numbered some 300,000 soldiers, but by the 4th century this force increased to at least 425,000. But higher estimates put this number to a whopping 645,000. The new army naturally needed an enlarged pool of revenue, and from the mid-3rd century, Roman emperors and their bureaucrats began to look for ways to collect more taxes from their subjects. One of the first steps the Roman state did was the confiscation of local revenues like endowments, tolls and taxes, monies that were previously used by the provincials at the provincial level. Another measure mid-3rd century emperors adopted during the peak years of the crisis was the rapid devaluation of the coinage. Especially from the 2500s onwards, the silver purity of the Antoninianus and denarius plummeted to almost non-existent levels, turning the Roman silver coins into little more than copper coins. This strategy produced more coins, but the inevitable result was massive price inflation, hoarding and the rise of the black market, as Roman merchants figured out rather quickly just how valueless the new coins were. In the end, debasement and price fixing were only temporary firefighting measures that only served to give the imperial regimes a breather in times of crisis. A more permanent solution was needed and was achieved under the reign of Diocletian, who systematized a new form of taxation, the annona militaris. While Rome and her eastern neighbor changed in the centuries between Augustus and the 3rd century crisis, the world of the Germanic tribes was not standing still either. As the imperial presence became permanent along the banks of the Rhine and the Danube, the Romans began to formalize their relationship with their barbarian neighbors and tried to turn the neighboring Germanic, Sarmatian and Dacian tribesmen into Roman clients, formalizing the relationship of the empire with them through treaties. Try as they may, however, peace was never permanently established on the frontiers, as military confrontations continued unabated. The most frequent form of fighting was small-scale raiding, but occasionally large-scale fighting also erupted on the frontiers, fighting that needed the presence of tens of thousands of imperial troops. By the 3rd century, the familiar tribes listed by Tacitus disappeared and were replaced by tribal confederations, such as the Franks, Alemanni, Saxons, Burgundians, or the Turingi Goths. It is likely enough that some kind of migration was behind this shift, but it probably did not take the form of a total replacement of the existing population, as we know that beneath the new names, some of the old tribes continued to exist. The structure of these new confederations also seemed to differ from the old ones, as unlike in the case of the old Germanic tribes, the leaders of these new ones became hereditary rulers, while in the case of the Alemanni rose a new power player, an over-king, whose status was superior to that of the traditional kings and princes. At the Battle of Strasbourg, for instance, the Caesar Julian is said to have faced 7 Alemanni kings, but the overall leader, the over-king leading the army, was a man called Nodomarius. This figure was not a one-off leader either, as in the next decades rose 2 more over-kings of the Alemanni, Vadomarius and Macrianus. Nor were the Alemanni the only Germanic tribal confederation who developed such a structure, as by the 36 Oghuz, the Tuvingi Goths also had such a leader in the figure of Athanaric, and it is possible that the father and grandfather of Athanaric already occupied such a position also. Between the 1st and 3rd centuries, Germania went through a political revolution that saw the creation of larger tribal confederations that were led by hereditary leaders. Leaders who at the peak of their power were now able to mobilize 20,000 to 30,000 men. Behind this political revolution, however, was an economic revolution. Due to improved agricultural methods, the Germanic tribes of Western Germania were able to produce more food than earlier, which saw their population grow markedly between the 1st and 3rd centuries. The achieved food surplus also allowed these societies to move a higher percentage of its population away from agriculture to other fields. Unsurprisingly thus, the Germanic tribes of the 3rd and 4th centuries were producing significantly more pottery, iron or precious metal products, such as weapons or jewelry. The new wealth of the Germanic people, however, was not shared equally among the population. In all likelihood, the elites of Germanic Europe succeeded in attributing for themselves an enlarged portion of this new wealth, which in turn allowed them to raise a significant number of armed men, a permanent standing force loyal to their paymaster, the presence of whom would have made the transmission of hereditary power possible over generations. Lacking written sources from Germania makes the reconstruction of this process hard, but to give just an example, Cnodomarius is said to have had a personal bodyguard of 200 men at Strasbourg. All in all, the enemies the Romans had to face at the end of the 3rd century were probably considerably stronger than the enemies Augustus had to face. In order to fight off the new challenges, the empire had to make the necessary adjustments. As mentioned earlier, the imperial army expanded significantly during the 3rd century, and in order to finance this new enlarged armed force, the Roman state needed to raise more revenue. To be able to collect it, however, the imperial bureaucracy needed to be expanded also. The growth of the new imperial administration also affected the provincial elites, as the Romanized provincials who previously served in their local councils now thronged to the bureaucracy to such an extent that Diocletian had to decree a new law that forced some of the sons of the former councillors to inherit the position of their fathers. The expansion of the army and the bureaucracy were developments that came about due to external threat, but there were also changes within the empire that would have happened regardless. By the mid-3rd century, the borders of the empire were stabilized for over a century, and most provinces were under imperial control for a significantly longer period, and the provincials, especially the elite, began to adopt to the empire and regard themselves as true Romans, leading to the rise of a Romanized provincial elite. All in all, the expansion of the army, bureaucracy, and the rise of the provincial elite shifted the center of gravity of the empire away from Rome. Thus, the significance of Rome began to decline from the 3rd century onwards, as emperors moved their headquarters to such cities as Trier, Mediolanum, Sirmium, Constantinople, or Nicomedia. The main reasons for this change were the facts that Rome was poorly situated strategically, and was too remote to allow emperors to immediately respond to rising threats. Rome no longer contained all the power players emperors needed to enlist to stabilize their regime either. In the days of the Republic, these power players were members of the Senate. Thus, the center of gravity of the Republic was situated in Rome. With the rise of imperial autocracy, the imperial court took the place of the Senate, but due to the reliance of early emperors on the senatorial class, the city of Rome still maintained its importance. But as the dominance of the Italian senatorial class over the army and administration was slowly eroded, the order of things was changing. By the late 3rd century, the status quo had been changed for good, and the power players who needed to be enlisted to the imperial regime were more widely dispersed in the form of the army, the rapidly growing imperial bureaucracy, and the Romanized landowning elite of the empire, who also provided the bulk of the upper echelons of the army and the bureaucracy. Yet, due to the internal and external developments, one capital and one emperor was simply no longer enough. The Persian challenge initially shook up the old status quo and forced the Romans into reforming their army and taxation system, but from the late 3rd century on, imperial presence was needed permanently in the eastern half of the empire to deal with the Sassanids. Diocletian realized this much pretty quickly, and rather than Rome, he made the city of Nicomedia his new headquarters. Yet, the danger of the emperor shifting his presence permanently eastward was that the absence of imperial presence in the western half of the empire would leave a power vacuum. And once the West came under pressure, usurpers would rise. Even without external pressure, the situation was more than a probability, as shown by later examples like in 392, when Emperor Theodosius tried to rule the empire from Constantinople, and within months rose the usurper Eugenius. Another good example of a distant province throwing up usurpers would be Britain, where many emperors were proclaimed during the later empire. Seemingly by this stage, if sections of the empire felt left out of imperial patronage, one way to resolve it was by raising the local general to the purple. By the time he came to power, Diocletian witnessed the rise and fall of several emperors firsthand, and he also seemingly understood the rationale that led to the unfortunate demise of his predecessors. Thus, rather than wait for usurpers to rise in the distant provinces, Diocletian willingly agreed to share the empire with a trusted colleague, Maximian. With Maximian heading westward, Diocletian elected to remain in the east. A few years later, 2 more men, Galerian and Constantius Chlorus, were elevated to the purple also, these figures becoming the junior partners and successors of the senior emperors. The system of Diocletian is today remembered as the Tetrarchy, and it was a clever attempt that tried to create legitimate power on all the troublesome frontier zones and solve the problem of succession at the same time. The system functioned well enough while Diocletian was in office and with his authority was able to secure it, but it collapsed almost immediately after the retirement of its creator. Nonetheless, despite the failure of the Tetrarchy, the rule of multiple emperors became the new norm in the 4th century, and apart from a few brief periods of single emperors, it was to remain so until the fall of the empire.